So today we're going to be talking about different types of editing. So with the types, we're going to be talking about line editing, content developmental editing, proofreading, writing coaching, and beta reading. Now I know beta reading doesn't typically count as an editing category, but a lot of self-publishers think that beta reading counts as editing. It's a different thing. So we're going to have a whole discussion about what beta reading is and isn't. Alright, so first we're going to jump into line editing. Line editing, well, actually, backtrack real quick. You should always ask your editor what they consider line editing, what they consider content editing, what they consider developmental editing, proofreading, writing coaching, and so on. Why? Because everyone has a slightly different definition, depending on who they are and how they were trained. These are the definitions that I learned when I was trained to be an editor, and the definitions that I've run into most commonly amongst other professional editors. However, that does not necessarily mean that your editor will follow these stereotypical guidelines. These are all guidelines that you need to be aware of, though, purely because of the fact that they are the generalized version. And as a result, once you ask your editor what they mean by these terms, it is going to be more likely that you're going to have a clear picture of what they mean and what it looks like, because I'm going to give you some examples of the different things as well. Alright, so for me, and for the way I was trained, line editing is fixing clarity of sentences, grammar, and making sure your tense is correct, and punctuation. Now, examples with that. Clarity. First example, he was the best in town. The best what? If that's your first sentence, super vague. And even if it's not your first sentence, that needs to be clarified. If you didn't clarify it before or after, that needs to be clarified. Next example is simply a lack of, what's the word? Better description. So, here we go. She sniffed at her sister. She didn't see anything wrong with what she had done, but she despised her for it because she had done it the way she had done it. Too many she's and hers, and we don't even know what it is. Done what? Did what? Who? Which one's the sister and which one's the one she's talking about? Too many she, hers. You need to clarify name and clarify who's doing what to the other person. That's confusing. So line editing can help with clarity examples like that. Some people consider that content editing though, which is why it's important to ask. However, I consider it under line editing, and a lot of people I know consider that. Next one is grammar. So an example of this is your classic good versus well. I want to do good in this class versus I want to do well in this class. Things like that. Sometimes they can be a little bit more tricky, but most of the time it's pretty simple as long as you've been well versed and polished in English, but not everyone is, and that's perfectly fine. We all have our own talents. And sometimes you want your character to sound a certain way, in which case you need to clarify that with your editor beforehand. Make sure your editor knows, hey, this character grew up in this backstory, so as a result, they have no idea about grammar and they struggle with grammar. That's fine. Just make sure that's clear beforehand. Next one is making sure that your tense is correct in your sentences. For example, they walked to the beautiful tree, its leaves swayed in the breeze. The tree runs away as it felt panic course through its veins. Now, there are lots of things confusing about that sentence, and I did that on purpose. But if the tree is truly running away, like let's say Lord of the Rings, they're kind of like living beings and they can actually walk and run, you don't say the tree runs, you say the tree ran. And instead of it felt panic course through its vein or it feels, you're going to want to change those tenses so it appropriately fits. The runs is the main problem. Felt is okay, although it could be improved. And as a result of that, you want to make sure that you smooth that out and make sure that it's all past or all present. Now, mainly, past is what's present, is what's the most prevalent here. As a result, that's probably what your editor is going to change it to. But if you meant to do present, then you want to make sure that if they try to change it to past, you're like, no, I messed up. The rest is supposed to be present. Okay. The next and final one is the one that line editors are most commonly known for, but the funny thing is line editors, this is only a small portion of line editing. and that is punctuation. So for example, her parents with apostrophe after mailbox, that's incorrect unless she has multiple sets of parents. However, if she has one set of parents, then having parent apostrophe s mailbox is correct. So it depends on the situation here. If she has multiple sets of parents, then the first one's perfectly valid. But if she only has one set of parents, you want the second one, not the first one. Alright, the next one that we're going to go over is content editing and developmental editing. Now again, content and developmental editing are not always the same thing in most people's minds. You want to make sure that your editor has a clear understanding and ask them, hey, is your content editing different than your developmental editing, or are they the same thing? For me, they're the same thing. However, some people actually consider them different things. So you want to make sure that you're absolutely clear about what you're getting up front. That way you're not purchasing a service that you don't feel you actually need. In my opinion, I think everyone needs a good developmental editor and a line editor, but that's just my opinion. Alright, so with content editing / developmental editing, it's going to be plot holes, magic system flaws if you're doing fantasy, character inconsistencies, making sure your foreshadowing isn't too obvious or too subtle to the point where we don't get it at all, that your emotional arcs are consistent, and that you're not having someone go flying through the stages of grief all in one chapter, and that it's slow and over the course of the book. And you also want to make sure that you have showing versus telling, or that it's tactful telling. Now, telling can sometimes be useful in conjunction with showing, but if it's entirely telling, that is a very juvenile form of writing. It's just not as good. I'll be honest, I've seen telling done well, but that's typically when it's tactful telling and paired with showing. The only time that telling is okay is when it is paired with showing, or it is done tactfully. Now, when I say tactful telling, what do I mean? Tactful telling is when it is explained in a way that is through the action. So you're telling us that she's grabbing at the air in ire and anger. So you're telling us that she's grabbing at the air in anger, but through telling us that, you can see just how much she's feeling. So it kind of shows through telling. If you're confused about that, please leave a comment below and I can give further examples. So with that, it's important to not just tell and say, she is angry, she is blonde, she has blue eyes. Why? Because it sounds like a factual textbook. It doesn't actually sound good. It doesn't sound good to read. It sounds like we're 5 and not a developed, well-versed writer. Whereas with the other, she shook her hands at the sky in fury. That's tactful telling. You're telling us that she's furious, but you're also showing us through her shaking her fist at the sky. As a result, you're pairing it together so it feels more flowing and tactful. Alright, so those are typically what you cover in content editing and developmental editing. Plot holes in particular are the biggest, most important one, and magic system flaws, because if there are flaws in your magic system, readers are going to be bugged by it. It's going to bother them, even if it's subconscious. A lot of readers don't like fantasy books, and they don't even know why. Part of why they don't like it is a magic system flaw that they sensed, can't quite identify. Whereas an editor, if I help identify, or if I or whoever you're choosing helps identify the said problem, then they feel more at ease and more soothed, and it doesn't bother them. It's like an itch you can't quite scratch. The next one, as I mentioned before, character inconsistencies. You want to make sure that your characters are consistent emotionally throughout all the time. You want to make sure that someone with a hot temper isn't suddenly very, very calm in a situation where they would totally not be calm. Or with foreshadowing, you want to make sure that you're not like, they are going to use this knife later. Too blunt. Whereas you don't want to be too subtle either and say, oh yeah, there's a knife in the room, and then just move on, and then 20 chapters later you bring up that knife again. It's like, whoa, I didn't even remember that was a thing. The next thing is emotional arcs, as I mentioned before. This is important because of things like stages of grief and mental health, and especially since a lot of that has been introduced into books more, it's important that it is portrayed correctly and that the emotional arc is fully developed and you don't just jump from one to the other. And then the last one, showing versus telling. Just make sure that you are displaying things through action. So for example, instead of she has blonde hair, saying she flipped her blonde braid, or saying she tossed her hair and rolled her green eyes, then you're saying she rolled her green eyes instead of saying she has green eyes. You're smoothly putting it into an action instead of just stating it like a fact. All right, let's plow through these last three since we only have 5 minutes left on the video. Proofreading. Now this is the biggest problem here. Everyone assumes that a proofreader does the same thing as a line editor. No, absolutely not. Proofreading does punctuation, yes. But that is the only part that is similar to line editing. They don't do any of the other stuff, clarity, grammar, etc. They're not supposed to do that. They can do it theoretically. For example, if I was a proofreader, I would totally add in those as a bonus benefit, but that's why you want to make sure you ask your proofreader beforehand what they do as part of their proofreading. Because typical proofreading is just punctuation, typos, confusing wording, or missing sentences. And when I say confusing wording, they aren't going to, like me, a line editor, tell you, this is confusing, here's how you clear it up. They're just going to say, this is confusing, fix it. That's not as helpful as a line editor telling you, here are some examples and things that I think might help clear it up. So it's subtle differences, but also drastic differences. In my opinion, it feels drastic, but maybe to you it feels more subtle, which is why I said subtle but drastic. So make sure if you're doing a proofreading, you got a developmental and a line editor first. Because if you don't do that, the proofreading isn't going to do you a whole lot of good, because you have bigger problems than that. And proofreading is just very over the surface. It's very fine-tuning. It's not as much in-depth. All right, the last two, writing coaching. This is when someone reads your stuff, gives you a minor edit maybe in the comments, but mainly they are going to meet with you via video calls or talk with you via email and teach you how to improve your craft just by saying, this sentence was great, but here's how it could be better. This first line was kind of boring. Here's what I think you should do instead. They kind of walk you through it instead of like an editor just leaving a comment and maybe giving an example or two, but more just telling you how to fix it. With writing coaching, they actually help you improve and hone your craft. It's kind of like tutoring, but a little bit more, or at least for me personally when I writing coach, but it's a little bit more personalized instead of just being general. Whereas with an editor, I might say, hey, you need an action tag here. And then give an example of a few action tags I think you could use. With writing coaching, I might explain why you need action tags, explain about how frequently you need them, explain why I think you need them in this particular piece, and things like that. It helps you actually look at it from a bigger holistic perspective instead of just that specific line. All right. And the final one, beta readers. Again, technically not an editor, but a lot of people consider them an editor. They are not an editor, and I'm sorry, they never will be. Beta readers are fantastic and you absolutely need them, 100%. Not bashing on beta readers, they are amazing. But the thing about beta readers is they cannot replace what an editor can do. Why? Because they are doing even less than a proofreader. Proofreaders are at least going line by line and checking on your stuff. Beta readers are just reading it like they would normally read it. No requirement, if they want to skip a scene, they can skip a scene. And they make sure when they read it, they aren't confused by anything. And if they are, they'll comment on it and be like, I'm kind of confused by how your magic system works here. Or they might comment and say, I really loved this scene. Or say, I don't like how so-and-so did this. But it's all opinion. It's not actual training. It's not actually going to fix your plot holes. It's not going to fix your magic system flaws. They might be able to point out some plot holes and magic system flaws, but the likelihood that they can suggest a remedy is not as high. Yes, they're helpful, yes, they're beneficial, and yes, you absolutely need them because it's important to know how your readers are reacting to what you're writing. However, it's also important to realize that they are not an editor, and what they do is distinctly different. It gives an overall opinion on the book. and maybe helps flesh out a few things, but it's not actual editing. All right, with that being said, please remember that we have a writing contest going on for adults and teens right now. And the entries are due by July 20th. I believe that's correct. Let me double check and make sure that I have that pulled up. Yes, July 20th by 8:45 p.m. If you get it any later than 8:45, I'm sorry. We have to close the library by 9. It's not going to count. Then, on top of that, for the award ceremony for that contest, we are going to be doing that from 4:30 to 5:30 on July 29th. And the best part is that you can come to an all-day writing conference before that. It's going to start at 10:30 a.m. and finish at 6 o'clock p.m. You're going to have tons of great classes by Kayla Rivera, Arlem Hawks, Ann Sutton, Natalie Brienne, and even Allie Cross. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. They are all amazing, beautiful authors, and I am so excited that we get to have lessons from them. They're going to be about character investment and supporting yourself as a writer, marketing ideas if you're self-publishing, and even if you're not self-publishing. Traditional publishing encourages you to look into that. And on top of that, we're going to have a Q&A with all the authors. One of them is going to be teaching about emotional roller coasters, and another one's going to be teaching about how to get from idea to an actual plan for a story. Honestly, I'm super excited. And they'll be selling their books and doing an author signing after, so if you have a particular personal question, you can stop by and ask them personally afterwards. So please come. I would love to see you all there. Thank you so much. Bye.